Hey guys, Ricardo with Phastek.com. Today I'm going to show you how to replace your worn out factory clutch with a Spec Stage 3 clutch in our 2010 SS. This can seem like a daunting task, but as I'm going to show you, there's a lot of big parts that just need to be moved out of the way to give us access to the factory clutch. We're going to start on the interior by removing the center console and loosening the shifter plate. Lift up on the edge of the console trim. This will allow you to remove the rest of the clips and set it aside. Once set aside, you can remove the 4 Phillips screws holding the shifter boot to the console. With those screws removed, you can now lift up on the shift knob to remove it. Be cautious as the shift knob is held in place very tightly. Now that the shift knob is out of the way, you can remove the 4 10mm bolts holding the shift plate to the tunnel. Moving on to the bottom side of the car, we will remove the tunnel brace by simply removing the 4 15mm bolts and set it aside. The factory exhaust will be removed as one piece. Loosen the 15mm nuts to the factory clamps and remove the rubber hangers from the exhaust system. Then, with the help of a friend, remove the exhaust system as one piece. With the exhaust out of the way, we can remove the 2 10mm nuts holding the heat shield in place. This will allow us to remove the drive shaft once loosened. Using a T60 Torx and an 18mm wrench, we are going to remove the bolts holding the drive shaft to the rubber couplers at the rear end and the transmission side. With the drive shaft loose from the ends, we can now remove the 2 15mm bolts holding the center bearing in place and set the drive shaft assembly aside. To give the transmission a bit of extra clearance, we will have to remove the rear O2 sensors from the catalytic converters to prevent any damage when lowering the transmission. Going along with the removal of the sensors, we can also remove all electrical connections to the transmission. This will include any harnesses that are held in place to prevent movement and any connection to the sensors or solenoids. With the harness aside, we can now remove the transmission lines. When removing these lines, be sure not to lose the clips that secure them in place. These will be needed when we go back together. Remove the two 13mm bolts holding the transmission lines to the transmission so they can be removed out of the way. The final line that will need to be disconnected is the clutch line. We will simply have to remove the clip and disconnect the line from the slave cylinder. Now that everything is moved aside as best as possible, we can get our transmission jack and position it to support the transmission while we remove the 4 bolts holding the transmission mount in place. Removing those 4 bolts will allow us to slowly lower the transmission so we can get the bolts holding the bell housing to the engine block. Loosening these bolts will cause the transmission to slightly move back. With all the bolts out, we can start to pull back the transmission and slowly lower it, making sure that it's clearing all necessary components to prevent any damage. After setting aside the transmission, we can now remove the factory clutch using a 13mm socket. Then remove the flywheel using a 15mm socket and set those items aside. We noticed on our car that we had a bit of an oil leak that looks to be coming from the rear main seal. While we have the transmission out of the way, we can simply replace that seal to save us in the long run. The new clutch comes with a pilot bearing that will need to be replaced. Using a pilot bearing tool, remove the bearing in place and replace it with the one from the kit. Also, since our car does have a bit higher mileage and we do not know how the previous owner treated it, we are going to be replacing the slave cylinder with a new one to ensure that we are getting a good, constant pedal feel. Going back together, we will want to clean the mating surface of the crank and flywheel free from any debris. Once we have a good clean surface, we can install the new flywheel and bolt it down with the proper torque spec. With the flywheel torqued in place, we can install the clutch and pressure plate using the clutch alignment tool. When bolting down the pressure plate, be sure to periodically check the clutch alignment tool to ensure that it does not bind and can move freely. If the tool cannot move freely, this will make the installation of the transmission a bit more difficult. Once we have the clutch where we want it, we can now reinstall the transmission. When going back together, ensure that you are careful when guiding the transmission past the pressure plate to prevent any damage. The transmission should line up fairly easy if everything was installed correctly. Some force may be necessary to get the last bit of the transmission in place. Once everything lines up, you can start to bolt the bell housing back in place and reinstall all other parts in reverse order. Now with everything put back together and our clutch bed properly, we can take this car for a drive. Following the braking procedure, we will want to put about 500 miles of stop and go driving before we are able to put the hammer down. Doing this will ensure proper clutch performance and keep us from having to do all this work again for a while. There you have it, guys. Our Spec Stage 3 clutch is installed and ready for some action. Thank you for watching. If you would like any more information about this product, go ahead and click the link in the description. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe for our future videos.